Well, welcome to the second day of our conference on giving. It looks like we're all here as friends of Arian. I'm Jim Smith. I've been a friend of Arian for a long time, and I think this is probably the fourth conference I've attended that she's organized. Arian has a way of creating remarkable intellectual journeys, and those who stayed on board yesterday were on a global trip, starting with the religions of the Mediterranean world, finding their way to India. I think we even journeyed to Polynesia briefly with Marcel Mauss. We had a temporal journey yesterday through evolutionary biology. We went back as far as 6 million years to meet some of our primate relatives. And then she took us on a kind of human biographical journey. We saw children helping without compensation or reward. Child labor, I guess, would have been an issue. We saw children drowning, and we even journeyed into the human body with images of the brain, pictures of breasts. It was a journey where we were walking in the shoes of others for much of the way. It occurs to me that seeing Peter Singer's Drowning Child, if we had been walking in the shoes of others, it would have been easy to step into the muddy pond. There are advantages in being on a panel on the second day, because we can reflect a bit on what we've heard. And I think today's panel is going to be answering some of the questions that came up during our discussion sections. Questions yesterday were about the role of philanthropy in a democratic society. They were about inequality and equity in our capitalist system, where voluntary transfers of wealth are one of our values. And there has been, I think, a discussion that will be much more explicit this morning about the logic of motivations, and we'll be seeing it through different lenses today, particularly the lens of economics and the policy lens of tax policy. I want to begin with a brief introduction of our speakers, and then we'll simply run right through their presentations and hold time for questions. We have Rob Reich from Stanford, professor of political science there, and the faculty director of the program in ethics and society, and the faculty co-director of the Center for Philanthropy and Civil Society. He has written a book, Bridging Liberalism and Multiculturalism in Education. He's co-edited a volume, Toward a Humanist Justice, the Political Philosophy of Susan Moeller, and he's been co-author of Democracy at Risk, How Political Choices Undermine Citizen Participation. Lou Daly is with us from Demos, where he directs the Sustainable Progress Initiative and is senior fellow there. He's author of God's Economy, Faith-Based Initiatives and the Caring State, published by the University of Chicago, and of Unjust Deserts, How the Rich Are Taking Our Common Inheritance, and of God and the Welfare State. He's also widely published in other fields. John Bacchia, professor of economics at Williams College, who has also been at Brookings. He's been in the Congressional Budget Office. He's been a visiting professor at Cornell, and I would say is one of the people we can learn the most about on the role of tax incentives in our philanthropic system. He's the author of Taxing Ourselves, A Citizen's Guide to the Debate Over Taxes. As I thought about this morning's session, I was reminded of a quote that I use often when I teach, and it seems to bring together questions of evolutionary biology, questions of equity and fairness. And it's a book that was edited by the 20th Century, or that was commissioned by the 20th Century Fund, which was the first public policy foundation I ever worked in. And I went back and I found the quote last night, and since it's probably exam time for at least 2 of our faculty members, I think we could set this quote up as the exam for this morning. Waldemar Nielsen, in his book, The Big Foundations, on the very first or second page, said, "In the great jungle of American democracy and capitalism, there is no more strange or improbable creature than the private foundation." Evolutionary biology at work here. Private foundations are virtually a denial of basic premises. Aristocratic institutions living on the privileges and indulgences of an egalitarian society, aggregations of private wealth which, contrary to the proclaimed instincts of economic man, have been converted to public purposes. Like the giraffe, they could not possibly exist, but they do. Gentlemen, discuss.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming on a Saturday morning. I want to begin with just a very simple observation. It's that the practice of philanthropy is as old as humanity. People have been giving money away, time away, their property away to others for as long as we know. In fact, as we heard yesterday, altruism might indeed be a big factor in evolution. What's novel about the contemporary practice of philanthropy is the availability of tax incentives to do so. The charitable contributions deduction in the United States is less than 100 years old. It was created by the US Congress in 1917, shortly after the institution of a personal income tax, federal income taxation in 1913. Celebrate the 100th anniversary of that next year. And similar incentives are built into the tax systems in most developed and many developing countries. So the contemporary practice of providing policy incentives, almost always in the form of some tax incentive, to stimulate the practice of charity or philanthropy is now common practice, although it's also the historical anomaly. More generally speaking, just outside the practice of tax incentives for any individual giving, laws govern the creation of foundations and nonprofit organizations. They spell out the rules under which these organizations can operate. The laws set up special tax exemptions for the organizations themselves, and they frequently permit tax concessions to individual and corporate donations of money and property to qualifying non-governmental organizations. So I guess the point I want to make here is something that is familiar to a political scientist, I suppose, but I think it's been absent from our discussion so far, so I want to say it very straightforwardly. Philanthropy is very much not the invention of the state, of a political society, but the form it has today, because of its structure within a political framework of governance. Philanthropy is an artifact of the state. We can be certain that philanthropy would not have the form it has today in the absence of the various laws that structure it and the tax incentives that encourage it. So, contemporary practice in which philanthropy is structured by a regulatory framework of incentives is not the norm, but the historical anomaly. Previously, prior to these incentives, political societies often protected the liberty of people to give money away, but did not provide them incentives to do so. So a natural question arises, for me at least: why do we have such incentives, and what's their justification in a democracy? Now, I didn't initially plan this as a part of the presentation, but after our discussion yesterday, I thought it might be important and useful. Our conversations so far have been largely data-free. And so I wanted to actually provide, despite the fact that my disciplinary training is as a political philosopher, not as a social scientist, a little bit of data about what philanthropy looks like in the US, at least. So this is data that comes from the US. First of all, looking not at the distribution of charitable dollars, but the creation of organizations that can receive tax incentivized giving. We have something over 1 million formally recognized nonprofits in the United States, and the IRS approval rate of new applications for nonprofit status is, I guess, what I would call staggering or unbelievably loose. The IRS approves somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 new 501c3 organizations every year. Its rejection rate of applications for nonprofit status hovers between 1% and 2% of all applications. So you can get a picture of what it looks like there. Of course, in the United States, even though they don't have to formally register as a nonprofit, any religious organization, congregation, synagogue, mosque, church, counts under tax purposes, for tax purposes, as a nonprofit organization. So the actual number of tax-exempt non-governmental organizations is somewhere between 1.3, perhaps as high as 2 million organizations in the US. That's on the organizational side. Now what about the charitable distribution side? Here's a picture of what giving has looked like in the United States over the past 40 years or so. It's gone up appreciably and has only dipped recently because of the Great Recession. One thing that you might take heart in, or feel quite, I think anyone should feel good about, is that though charitable giving has on balance gone up over the course of American history, and in particular as the last sort of generation, and while it's dipped somewhat during recession years, on average, Americans have given away roughly 2% of gross domestic product for about 60 or 70 years. That goes up or down depending upon some very minor changes, but more or less there's a constant rate of giving, something about 2% of GDP in the United States. Now, where do people give their money away? And this gets to the heart of the name of our conference, giving, caring for the needs of others. Here's a picture of giving in 2011. Just shy of $300 billion given away, $298 billion. This data comes from the Giving USA project, which is connected to the Center on Philanthropy at Indiana University. There are 4 sources of charitable giving in the United States: from living individuals, from individuals who have died and made bequests, from foundations, and from corporations. Living individuals account for the large majority of all charitable giving in the US, which, if you aren't a student of the nonprofit sector of philanthropy, I think might come as a surprise, because given the amount of press attention that foundations receive, one might be led to believe that foundations actually account for a larger part of actual giving in the United States than they do. Individuals, if you count those who make bequests along with those who are still alive, it's around 80% of all charitable giving. Now, the pie chart on the right shows where they give their money to. For a very long time, individuals have given, the largest recipient of charitable dollars has been religion. And they give to their church, they give to their synagogue, they give to their mosque, whatever it happens to be. Important for the theme of this conference is to recognize that faith-based social service organizations are not counted in the large sector of the pie graph there in religion. Faith-based social service organizations are counted in the appropriate either health or human services or education category. Now, if you think that charity or philanthropy is or ought to be something about giving and caring for the needs of strangers, something like assistance for the desperately badly off, assistance for the poor, you'll notice that it doesn't account for an actually very appreciable amount of giving in the United States. So I want to try and give you a better picture of that. Here's a little graph meant to give you an idea about where people give their money away, and in particular now breaking down some of this by income category. All things considered, giving to religion accounts for somewhere between 40 and 60%. Here the number is 61%. This comes from a 2006-2007 study carried out also at the Center for Philanthropy at Indiana. Notice three notches over the very narrow band labeled basic needs. Basic needs, giving for the basic needs of individuals accounts for about 10% of all charitable giving in the United States. Caring for the needs of strangers does not constitute, descriptively speaking, very much of what happens in the United States in terms of charity or philanthropy. The picture is even more dire if you think that that's an important part of what charity is or ought to be, if you look at the giving patterns of the wealthy. So the table down below shows that the percentage of giving for those who have an income over $1 million is only 4% of all of their giving for basic needs. Now, what if I wanted to be, this is again from the same paper at the Center on Philanthropy at Indiana, let's make the very best case scenario to try to pump up with the most generous assumptions possible where caring for the needs of strangers could come in. So with all these other categories, health, education, religion, since congregations actually do sometimes carry out social service provision for the needy, and certain education philanthropy might go for financial aid for the poor, similarly with giving to health. Let's try and just maximize the amount of giving in each of those other sectors that might plausibly be said to be assistance for the poor. So if you blow that up with the most generous assumptions you can make, for all donors, you get to 31% of all charitable giving, and for donors more than $1 million, it's 22%. So that's the descriptive landscape of what charitable giving looks like in the United States. What I want to do now is suggest to you, keeping in mind the incentive structure for giving, is the following. The more you think that charity is or ought to be about caring for the needs of strangers, the less sense you can make of the current incentive structure for giving in the United States. In actual practice, philanthropy is really not much about caring for the needs of strangers. But what I want to suggest is perhaps this is not something to worry about. It's not a problem because caring for the needs of strangers is not the task, not the mission of either charity or philanthropy. Charity and philanthropy might be thought to have a broader mission, a wider scope than simply providing for the poor. So this leads to the question I want to ask. It's a question of a political philosopher. It's a question of ideal theory. It's a question I think Helmut Anheier put on the table for us yesterday when he described in the beginning of his talk how if we were to wipe away all of the current institutions of society and build society from scratch, would we include the institutional form known as a foundation or as a nonprofit? And would we build into our utopian imaginings something like an incentive for giving money away? Notice this is not a question about whether or not charity philanthropy should respond to various forms of actual dysfunction or corruption. This is a question of ideal theorizing. Now, in order to ask that question and then begin to give an answer to it, what I want to begin with is what I think ought to be a kind of familiar thought, or at least an intuition, which is that if we were building out an ideal society, and we assumed that the institutions, at least of the political order, were consistent with social justice, whatever your view of social justice happened to be, you might be led to the thought that the need for charity or philanthropy would diminish considerably, perhaps even go away entirely. If we had social justice, we wouldn't have the need for charity. So I offer that just as a preliminary intuition or thought about ideal theorizing and whether or not charity or philanthropy would have a place in a socially just order. Okay, so with the remaining time left, I want to basically provide the framework that I think is appropriate for giving an answer to the question of what role charity or philanthropy would play in an ideal political order, in particular liberal democracy, and then just gesture at an answer or justification for what I'll suggest to you is an answer. Okay, so very simplistically and in certain respects just reductively, what I want you to do in order to motivate this question of political philosophy is assume something like the following. Assume we have some garden variety features of a liberal democracy. So we've got a limited state, and we have robust individual rights that protect the liberties of individuals in that state. Assume second that there's a private property regime, so that people who have individual rights, individual liberties, can claim those rights and liberties over their property. And in particular, then get up and running whatever tax system you think is the appropriate one to use. So consistent with your view of whatever justice requires, get up and running a tax system. We've got individual liberty, we've got private property, and we've got some tax system or another consistent with whatever is appropriate in your view. Okay, people have some stuff. They've been taxed in whatever way is appropriate. They have some property stuff left over. They decide they want to give it away for some ostensibly public-facing, charitable, or philanthropic purpose. What attitude should the liberal democratic state have towards that individual preference? That's the simple and fundamental question as a political philosopher I want to put on the table. How should a liberal democratic state, in ideal theory, think about the individual preference of someone to give money away that is duly and rightly theirs for some philanthropic, charitable purpose? Now, it seems to me there are only three possible answers to this question. The first is what I would call potentially the default position, which would be non-interference. If it's your money, you've been taxed in some way or another, you have individual rights, you've got private property, you want to give it away for some purpose, the appropriate treatment of that by the state is to leave you alone to do what you want with your stuff. So stand away from any individual's preference to give money away. Let them do as they wish. The second possibility would be that the state should interfere, constrain, or perhaps forbid the exercise of one's liberty to give money away for philanthropic or charitable purposes. And if it were to do so, it would need to have some very good justification for interfering with the liberty of someone who had the preference to give it away for a charitable purpose. Sometimes, in actual fact, liberal democracies do indeed limit or forbid people to give money away for some public-facing purpose. Think, for example, in the US, even though this is different in the era of Citizens United, there still remain certain restrictions on campaign finance contributions, a public-facing distribution of your own dollars, and you can't give unlimited amounts, even though the money is uncontestedly yours, to fund a particular candidate's campaign. Think also of estate taxation. No one believes that the money might actually be the state's and it wasn't yours to try to give and pass on to your heirs. The question is rather something else. Are there other compelling reasons, something having to do with intergenerational equality or social mobility, that provide a justification for limiting the liberty of individuals to transfer money to their children or relatives in an unconstrained way? So the second possibility is limit the liberty of people to give money away, which leads to the third possibility. You can probably predict what it is at this point. If we're not going to have the state be non-interfering with the individual preference of people to give money away, and we're not going to have the state interfere with the liberty of people to give money away, the state's third option would be to subsidize or incentivize the liberty of people to give money away. That, as I described before, is the actual practice in the United States. And the simple question I want to ask is, why would, in ideal theory, any liberal democracy subsidize the liberty of people to give money away? In other words, try to provide an incentive to do something that people already have the liberty to do on their own. Okay, so returning to what I take to be my fundamental question, what's the justification for the current practice in the United States and elsewhere of providing tax incentives for citizens to make charitable contributions? Because the tax incentive constitutes a subsidy, the loss of federal tax revenue, it's not an exaggeration to say that the United States and other countries currently subsidize the liberty of people to give money away, foregoing tax revenue for an activity that for millennia has gone unsubsidized by the state. The United States has the most generous subsidy structure, I think, in the entire world. Charitable giving in the United States in 2011, as you see, was just shy of $300 billion, which cost the US Treasury, roughly speaking, $50 billion in lost tax revenue. For anyone following the negotiations going on right now in Washington, D.C., you know that this is an important figure because it's part of the potential strategy to generate more money, avoid the fiscal cliff by broadening the base, limiting deductions in order to generate more revenue without raising tax rates. Okay. Question, what reason could there be for a liberal democracy to provide an incentive to people to exercise a liberty to give money away? I think there are three different potential justifications for a liberal democratic state providing an incentive for people to exercise the liberty to give money away philanthropically or charitably. I'm just very briefly going to describe what I think those three potential justifications are, and then in the version of the paper, I provide much more detailed argument in defense of the third of these justifications, so that the answer to the question, does in ideal theory a liberal democratic state have any justification whatsoever for subsidizing the liberty of people to give money away? I think the answer is yes, it does. The justification, I think, is much different than the one that might plausibly be thought to be attached to the current method of providing incentives in the United States, and would lead to a much different kind of philanthropy than we have. Okay. Let me then now mention these three different potential justifications. The first is what I would call the tax-based rationale, which is to say the proper way to think about taxable income in the first place would never include charitable contributions. So the fair way to treat anyone's charitable contributions is never to have included them in the tax base in the first place. For a variety of reasons, I think this is a faulty justification. The second justification is what I would call the subsidy rationale, and it's the traditional one. And the idea is that by subsidizing the liberty of people to give money away and foregoing federal tax revenue in the process, the state is providing an incentive to create a certain type of social good that either it would prefer not to create on its own for some reason, or that we would get more of it than we could provide simply by collecting the tax revenue we would have otherwise. Now we provide an incentive to people to give money away. We get more of what we would provide than had we just simply taxed people in ordinary circumstances. The third justification is what I'll call the pluralism rationale. This is the one I think actually is the best one. And the idea here is that instead of thinking of the subsidy as something that produces an array of social goods that the state either couldn't or couldn't provide enough of on its own, the pluralism rationale is meant to recognize something about the importance of the voice of citizens in a contestatory, diverse, and decentralized civil society, so that citizens have a way of participating in this intermediary sphere of civil society and associational life that amplifies their voices in a particular way. I'll say a bit more about that in a second. Okay, let me organize myself here and get to where I want to go. All right, I mentioned that I don't think that the tax-based rationale is especially persuasive. In the interest of time, I'm going to pass right over that without saying anything more about it and focus on the subsidy rationale, the subsidy justification, and then the pluralism justification. In part because I think that John in particular is going to give you some data about just how powerful the actual current mechanism of a tax deduction for your charitable contributions is in the United States. Okay, so here's what the subsidy rationale looks like. The typical defense of the charitable contributions deduction is that the state accomplishes something of important social value by providing subsidies for people to be charitable. The state provides incentives for charitable behavior because it's believed that the incentives stimulate the production of something of greater social value than what the state could have produced on its own had it not offered the incentives in the first place. Now, I think this is a piece of familiar wisdom, but in case there's students in the audience who haven't yet filled out a tax form of any kind, I guess it's important just to mention this. The subsidy under this definition or this conceptualization counts as what economists or tax folks call a tax expenditure, the fiscal equivalent of a direct spending program. When the state allows citizens to deduct their charitable contributions from their taxable income, the state forgoes tax revenue, which is to say that all taxpayers are actually affected. They're affected in at least two important ways. First, citizens stand to lose some portion of the benefit they receive from direct governmental expenditures. If every citizen gains some fraction of the total revenue of the federal budget, the loss of $50 billion in tax revenue through the deduction lowers every citizen's fractional benefit. Second, and this came up in yesterday's conversation, citizens lose in democratic accountability, for the foregone funds are not accountable or even necessarily traceable in the way that direct government expenditures are. To give an obvious example, citizens can unelect representatives if they're dissatisfied with the spending programs of the state, and as I mentioned in a question I posed yesterday, the Gates Foundation could be said to have a domestic spending program, partly supported through tax subsidies, but its directors and trustees can't be unelected. So, the success of the subsidy rationale depends on whether or not the benefits brought about by it exceed the costs of the lost tax revenue. I want to mention two things about the tax deduction structure as a way of suggesting to you it has a weak, there are only weak arguments in favor of it, and then one other more fundamental objection, and then say something about the pluralism rationale. So the first thing to recognize about this mechanism, the deduction, is that you only can claim the deduction as a taxpayer if you are an itemizer on your taxes. If you itemize your taxes, then you can itemize every single charitable contribution you make and deduct those contributions from what your taxable income is. If you aren't an itemizer, which changes the amount of which changes every year, then you can't claim your charitable contributions at an individual level. It's thought to be bundled into the standard deduction. But which is to say the following. This is the first oddity, or I would say unfairness about the current mechanism in the US. If I am not an itemizer and I give $1,000 to the new school as a charitable contribution, and Jim is an itemizer and he gives a $1,000 contribution to the new school, that $1,000 contribution to the new school costs me $1,000. I'm $1,000 worse off than I would be otherwise. If Jim is in the 30% tax bracket and he gives the same $1,000 to the same organization, producing ostensibly the same social good, that $1,000 contribution costs him $700, and he can write off $300 on his tax return. So that seems to me a capricious treatment of two identical donors making the identical gift. Second objection or unfairness to the current mechanism is that there's what economists call an upside-down structure to the subsidy. The wealthier you are, the higher tax rate you pay, the greater the subsidy is. This is a function of the progressive tax system itself. It's a matter of math or logic. So again, imagine that John at the end of the table is in the 35% tax bracket, and I'm in the 20% tax bracket, and we're both itemizers. John makes the $1,000 gift to Doctors Without Borders. That $1,000 gift, because he's taxed at the rate of 35%, actually costs him $650, and he is $350 comes off his tax bill. I make the identical $1,000 gift to the identical organization, again producing ostensibly the identical social good in the world. And because I'm in the 15% tax bracket, that $1,000 gift costs me $850, where I only lose $150 off my tax bill. So identical amounts of the donation, identical recipient organization. The wealthier you are, the cheaper it is to give. Or as a philosopher might put it, the opportunity cost of virtue is less the higher you go up the income scale. Now, I don't consider this a fundamental criticism of the deduction or the subsidy rationale, because what we could do is we could tinker with the mechanism we have that provides an incentive. We don't need to have the deduction. That's not some fixed piece of public policy. In fact, it's up for debate this very week in Washington, D.C. How might we evaluate the subsidy rationale as a whole, not taking into account the deduction structure itself? So here, and I'll be very curious to see what John has to say about this, if we suppose that the goods produced by charitable giving are of some social value, we might ask just simply whether the subsidy, whatever form it takes, tax credit, tax deduction, something else, we might ask whether the subsidy is so-called treasury efficient. Does the subsidy shake out more in donations than it costs in federal tax revenue? If it shakes out more money than people would give in the absence of the incentive, then the subsidy is treasury efficient. Economists will then argue, I think this is what John's paper will be about, economists will then argue about the optimal rate of the subsidy, or how to stimulate the most giving at the least cost to the treasury. And the best empirical analyses that I am aware of say that the current mechanism in the United States, the tax deduction, is indeed treasury efficient, although significantly less than initially thought. So treasury efficiency essentially ensures us that the subsidy is not a mere reward, a pat in the back for doing something that you would do anyway, and actually produces more social good than would be the case if we didn't have any incentive whatsoever. But when you go back and think about the distribution of charitable dollars in the United States and the kaleidoscopic array of organizations that are eligible to receive them in the US, the idea that you can set up shop as a nonprofit organization with virtually any mission you want, we have to ask questions about exactly what kind of social goods are being produced with this subsidy. And in particular, what we have to ask is whether or not the amount of social good produced is more through the giving to nonprofit organizations than would have been the case had we simply taxed people and then received more federal revenue and the distribution of that dollar. In other words, I think the appropriate counterfactual is something like this. Suppose that charitable donations were redistributive in the sense that gifts from the relatively wealthy were flowing to the relatively poor. Even if you granted this, which the data I showed you should lead you to doubt, but even if you were to think that that was what charitable giving was about, we may nevertheless not yet conclude that nonprofit organizations and foundations are in fact redistributive, all things considered, because we have to account still for the tax concessions to philanthropy and the counterfactual scenario in which the money flowing into nonprofit organizations and foundations would have been taxed and become public revenue. The relevant question is not merely, is philanthropy redistributive, but rather, do philanthropic dollars flow more sharply downward than government spending does? In order for the return, so to speak, on the public's investment in philanthropy to be worthwhile, philanthropy must do a better job than the state would do had it taxed those philanthropic assets in the first place. I think the case to be made for that counterfactual is a speculative and ultimately an empirical one. I doubt that it would work out all that well. I have a whole set of other arguments I could offer you, but I want to spend my last 2 minutes saying something about the pluralism rationale. All right, so the pluralism rationale that I do think is good. I would sign on to the idea that this rationale provides a good reason for a liberal democratic state operating an ideal theory to provide incentives to people to give money away. The basic idea here is the following. The tax incentive to make charitable donations should not be justified on the basis of assessing the discrete social goods that are produced, looking at whatever organizations receive the money and trying to decide what kinds of outputs there are from nonprofits. But instead, the tax incentive is justified for its role in stimulating or enhancing the voice of citizens in the production of a diverse, decentralized, and pluralistic associational sector, which in turn is thought to be the bedrock of a flourishing democracy. If nonprofit organizations are the institutional face of associational life, then stimulating charitable contributions to a wide array of nonprofits might amplify the voice of citizens and enhance civil society to the overall benefit of liberal democracy. Okay. Last couple ideas, just to give you a flavor of the pluralism rationale here. Here's a passage from a Supreme Court opinion from Justice Lewis Powell concerning the tax structure in the nonprofit organization. This is the Bob Jones versus United States case in 1983. Here's something from Justice Powell. I do not believe that the primary function of a tax-exempt organization, a nonprofit, is to act on behalf of the government in carrying out government-approved policies. In my opinion, this view of the 501c3 sector, the tax code that we call nonprofits in the US, ignores the important role played by tax exemptions in encouraging diverse, indeed often sharply conflicting activities and viewpoints. As others have observed, private nonprofit groups receive tax exemptions because each group contributes to the diversity of association, viewpoint, and enterprise essential to a vigorous, pluralistic society. Far from representing an effort to reinforce any perceived common community conscience, the provision of tax exemptions to nonprofit groups is one indispensable means of limiting the influence of government orthodoxy on important areas of community life. So here's the idea that I want to champion. In a diverse society, in a society where liberties permit people to champion different ideas of what the good life is, and indeed different ideas of what a public good is and that should be funded, there will be diverse and heterogeneous preferences about what kinds of social goods the state ought to supply through direct expenditures of tax dollars. Now, democratic mechanisms themselves for deciding how to allocate tax dollars are, of course, one fundamental means of dealing with the heterogeneous preferences of citizens. The preferences here in the typical political science mode of thought would be the preferences of the median voter, would assume a large, if not wholly determinative role in explaining how it is that direct federal expenditures are sent out. But here's the pluralism rationale now at work. Another potentially important means is to decentralize the authority for deciding what kinds of social goods are produced and to permit, indeed, to enhance citizen voice in this process by providing a subsidy for that voice. Tax incentives for charitable giving represent, on this view, an effort to stimulate every citizen to cast his or her preferences in the form of dollars about their favored social goods into civil society, where the resulting funding stream is partly private from the donor and partly public from the tax subsidy. Now, I'll conclude by noting here that if you have been moved at all by the very little bit I've said here about the pluralism rationale, ideas about caring for the needs of strangers, about the importance of some redistributive function of charity and philanthropy have begun to recede a bit from view. When the justification for incentivizing charitable behavior runs along this pluralist line, philanthropy is not, or at least not in the first instance, about assisting the poor or disadvantaged. It's instead about protecting and promoting a flourishing and pluralistic civil society. And it's important here that the mechanism that is deployed under this pluralism rationale not incorporate into it a kind of plutocratic bias, where the rich, because of their higher wealth and the subsidy structure we now have, their voice is amplified, and the poor have less of it. I'll stop there, having merely tried to suggest a range of things that are wrong with the current structure, and having suggested maybe just a bit about why you might wish to sign on to the pluralist rationale, and turn it over to my fellow panelists. Thanks.
Well, thank you. I want to thank Professor Mack first for organizing this conference. Very well conceived conference and very rich in substance. And it's an honor for me to be here. And I also want to thank my fellow panelists for the important contributions they're making on these questions. I probably have a little bit of a different profile here insofar as I work in the trenches of public policy development, if that's not too ridiculous an analogy. In other words, I work at a think tank, and we're sort of the daily grind of policy development and trying to achieve social betterment. In my research, I work in the field of policy history, as well as legal history, and to some extent political philosophy, as these fields pertain to welfare state development and welfare state design, somewhat in a comparative light between Europe and the United States. And what I want to talk about today is a particular set of issues on the question of welfare state design in the United States that surround the role of religious organizations and faith-based social service providers in particular as part of our social safety net. So if my colleagues on the panel are mostly looking at sort of the incentive structure for our giving system, the political economy of giving, and the democratic justifications of giving, I want to focus on the institutional composition of our public giving system, our public social safety net, which, of course, significantly overlaps with the religious nonprofit sector. So in a highly self-organized society, thinking of Tocqueville's observations of Jacksonian America, the zeal for association being so strong in our history, in particular, a tendency to self-organize societally through associations and through religious associations. There are a lot of issues that arise in the context of the public giving system, the public social safety net, and the overlap that occurs in terms of mission, in terms of responsibility, in terms of the pursuit of better outcomes between sort of government responsibility for social recovery and religious institutions and how they see their mission in the work of social recovery. In the 19th century, this question of mission overlap really where you have the problem of previously sort of functions that were previously mainly carried out by churches being taken up by and being taken over by, in some cases, government. You know, this is where you begin to have legal and political conflicts that need to be resolved. And in the 19th century, you know, all of this kind of conflict sort of fell under the banner of Kulturkampf, a clash of worldviews where essentially it was church versus state in terms of who has the claim on the mission of social recovery and on the value system of social recovery in a society. In the United States, our version of the Kulturkampf, the mission overlap between government and religious institutions, came much later and really reached an acute stage beginning in the 1970s, partly just because of the periodicity of our welfare state development, which, as many of you know, has been a laggard historically. We really didn't have any kind of a federal welfare system until we had the Great Depression and the development of the New Deal. So the particular example that I'm going to focus on is, this seems like ancient history, but just a little over 10 years ago, George W. Bush, when he became president, basically his first act and his main domestic policy, at least in his first term, was something called the faith-based initiative that many of you may remember was a very controversial thing. And essentially that was an effort to help resolve the Kulturkampf in the US context of religious and government overlap in this area. And the sort of objective of the faith-based initiative back then was to essentially to pluralize, in Rob's sense, the social safety net by lowering church-state barriers, constitutional barriers within the public social safety net in order to allow greater diversity, and in particular greater religious diversity of the institutions that are part of the various contracting regimes under social welfare statutes. And so partly it was to enlarge the role of faith-based organizations in public provision of services, and to do that in a way where there was a lower church-state bar, in a sense, to do that in a way that didn't require faith-based organizations to secularize themselves in order to participate in the public system. And there were all kinds of rules around that objective. Now, I was by no means a supporter of President Bush, but I was a supporter of President Bush's faith-based initiative, much to the chagrin and dismay of many of my colleagues who had no idea where I was coming from when I would write positive columns about the faith-based initiative back in the day. And so today I want to kind of take you through the reasoning and in some sense the policy history that led me to be supportive of that domestic initiative. So you really do have to go back to the New Deal and the Great Depression to understand the roots of the faith-based initiative and the roots of sort of the ongoing debates about that type of policy that continue today. So of course, prior to the Great Depression, we had no federal social safety net. We had some federal subsidies for institutionalized care, like orphan care and health care, but essentially no federal capacity for direct aid of any kind, or for social services sort of outside of those two institutionalized areas that I mentioned. Of course, with the Great Depression and skyrocketing unemployment and the catastrophic need for emergency relief, all of that changed very rapidly and strikingly. So by 1935, under the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the federal government had given out something like $3 billion in direct material aid to the unemployed. And then when FERA was closed, unemployment insurance was folded into the Social Security legislation that in 1935, and then we also had the passage of Aid to Dependent Children, which was the first cash subsidy program for poor people. Now, what's really important to understand is that part of the political process of establishing federal material aid in the 1930s was the development of something called the anti-subsidy position, which essentially meant that it's complicated, but it was sort of if the federal government is going to get into the business of providing aid on a large scale, it has to be disentangled from patronage politics through the local instrumentalities of aid. This was what Harry Hopkins and ultimately Franklin Roosevelt saw as an important sort of legitimation issue that they needed to establish in order to validate a new and large role for the federal government, that it would be disentangled. So what you saw emerge there was an aid structure grounded in this notion of anti-subsidy, meaning that the role of the federal government is not to subsidize what other people are doing in their communities. The role of the federal government is to provide direct aid to households. Now, this policy structure of federal aid and on the one hand and private services on the other was really sustained into the early 1960s. In Bixby's well-regarded tabulations, as of 1960, federal expenditures on welfare for the poor totaled about $2 billion, and almost all of this was material assistance to households under Aid to Dependent Children and other anti-poverty programs. So in 1960, as late as 1960, there was essentially no funding for social services in federal anti-poverty programs. Nevertheless, long before conservatives gained a foothold in national politics by calling for welfare reform, in fact, it was liberal policy leaders like Wilbur Cohen who began to contemplate a greater role for social services in anti-poverty programs. This is the beginnings of what we now know of as welfare to work or welfare reform model of the welfare state. They moved decisively in this direction when they returned to the White House under John F. Kennedy in 1960. And they really set out to fundamentally transform this New Deal division of labor between public relief and private services. And the start of that was in 1962. Kennedy signed into law a set of public welfare amendments under the Social Security Act, I think, initiating what Martha Durthick describes as, quote, a more or less distinct category of grants to the states for social services. More memorably, perhaps, under Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society, we had the Office of Economic Opportunity, created in 1964, and that began to fund a large range of community-based service programs, and federal spending on these services rose from roughly $50 million in 1965 to $752 million, excuse me, in 1970. Another set of amendments to the Social Security Act further revised the national focus to put more of an emphasis on social services, and also started moving away from the therapeutic approaches long favored in so-called scientific charity and moving more in the direction of work-related services such as job training, child care support, and financial incentives for work. This is the roots of today's welfare reform policy. I want to point to an excellent study. Thank you, Rob. Andrew Morris, in his study, The Limits of Voluntarism, takes us through this policy history and does a great job. I really recommend that book, and I rely on Dr. Morris's book quite a bit for my talk here. So, as he put it, the war on poverty and the growing emphasis on concrete welfare-to-work services opened the door to what he describes as quote, the wider interpenetration of voluntary agencies with public money and the public sector. So the funding of voluntary agencies with public money on a wide scale, and also combined with the creation of new nonprofit agencies supported almost, in some cases, entirely by government, this created a new nonprofit sector, essentially, that blurred the lines between traditional charity and public institutions. And as a fiscal matter, this transformation was extremely significant. So again, according to Bixby, between 1960 and 1970, federal spending on social services, non-existent before 1960, rose from essentially 0 to 522 million. By 1980, it rose to 1.8 billion, and by 1995 to 2.8 billion. And you see parallel developments in terms of the funding composition of the nonprofit sector naturally over the same period. Even by 1974, government funding at all levels was responsible for nearly 50% of total nonprofit revenue in the United States. And by the early 1990s, as many of you know, our country's largest social service providers, such as Catholic Charities and Jewish Board of Family and Children's Services, were receiving most of their funding from government. By 2001, only 44% of funding authorized under temporary assistance for needy families, which of course replaced aid to dependent children in the 1996 welfare reform bill, only 44% was being spent on direct cash benefits. Most of the money was being spent on child care and other services to help move the poor from welfare to work. And so today, in light of all that, it's very clear that that New Deal alignment of social welfare has been transformed and in some ways reversed. Government has increasingly gotten out of the relief business, while private provision of welfare services is now heavily subsidized by the government and increasingly at the center of policy development. So what does this mean in terms of the role of faith-based providers, and in particular the constitutional issues and the political issues in the American context of so-called church-state separation? This was our Kulturkampf. You know, the New Deal division shifted. Stephen Smith and Michael Lipsky describe it well. Nonprofit agencies became agents of government in the expansion of the welfare state. This was famously described by Donald Kettle as the new government by proxy system. This has been widely studied, and it's increasingly understood in policy history, but you know, the church-state issues as part of that have been less carefully studied, in my view. Far from being a sort of a new front in the culture war, as someone who reviewed one of my books put it, increasing church-state cooperation, apropos George Bush's faith-based initiative, in social welfare really followed a very clear structural pattern in policy history, and recognizable in these two phases. First, the anti-subsidy phase, no role for federal government in social services, and later the subsidy phase, where we're getting out of the relief business and into the social service business. You know, so as welfare spending was significantly restructured, creating a larger public role for social services, faith-based providers were essentially thrust into church-state conflict by the new political economy of welfare spending and the fiscal compulsion of that. So that at the time, there was a prevailing, arguably extreme separationist kind of church-state legal culture. And this was forged in heated battles over parochial schools, parochial school funding, prayer in public schools, and so forth. But that separationist church-state legal culture was quite ill-fitted to the emerging policy landscape of public support for social services, and really quite rigidly unresponsive given the large fiscal impetus this created for closer cooperation. So no-aid separationism, as legal scholar Carl Esbeck termed it, was kind of driving a constitutional wedge between religion and government, even as federal policy and spending were restructuring the social safety net in ways that increasingly overlapped with the work and mission of faith-based providers. I want to indulge this quote from Justice Black's remarkable dissent in Board of Education versus Allen. This was a 1968 decision. Ultimately, it upheld a New York State textbook loan program for which religious schools were eligible, but in the long run, Justice Black's reasoning in his dissent actually prevailed. This is how he described why the federal government should be involved in subsidizing textbooks where religious schools can be eligible for that. He wrote, "It is true, of course, that the New York law, textbooks, does not as yet formally adopt or establish a state religion, but it takes a great stride in that direction. And coming events cast their shadows before them. The same powerful sectarian religious propagandists who have succeeded in securing passage of the present law to help religious schools carry on their sectarian religious purposes can and doubtless will continue their propaganda, looking toward complete domination and supremacy of their particular brand of religion. And it nearly always is by insidious approaches that the citadels of liberty are most successfully attacked." Black's argument, whereby a textbook loan program leads to Catholic Church's domination of America obviously went to extremes. But as I mentioned, over the next decade, the bar of separation was increasingly raised to Black's desired standard of no aid and no contact between religious institutions and the government. Lemon versus Kurtzman, Committee for Public Education versus Nyquist, Meek versus Pittenger, all consolidated a regime of no-aid separationism, basically throwing out even modest forms of indirect aid, maintenance and repair grants, eligibility for programs supplying instructional materials, auxiliary services, and tax benefits related to private school tuition. All of that was banned. Now, Carl Esbeck, again, one of the legal scholars who's contributed most, I think, to the beneficial evolution of church-state law in a more pluralistic direction over the last 30 years, he described sort of the upshot in this way. With the advent of the welfare regulatory state in the middle third of this century, continuing to enforce a strict rule of no aid has the effect of confining religious social ministries to ever smaller enclaves of private life, very much cutting against the grain of Ropp's pluralistic philosophy of the social safety net. If the charities of faith-based groups are to participate along with secular organizations in meaningfully serving civil society, they are put to a cruel choice. No-aid separationism demands that religious ministries either secularize and thereby qualify for government aid, or close their doors for lack of funding. This is the political economy piece, the compulsion. Thus, in its present-day impact, no-aid separationism is hostile toward faith-based charities, not neutral. The changed circumstances work such unfairness that denial of all aid is no longer a plausible ordering of church-state relations. The absence of even-handedness not only suffocates social and religious pluralism by creating a monolithic, secular-dominated structure for the delivery of welfare services, but the no-aid view eliminates a fuller range of provider choices for the poor and needy. So it reached a breaking point in the late 1990s, and beginning in the early 80s, with a more sympathetic Supreme Court, a series of decisions, Widmer versus Vincent, Board of Education versus Mergens, Bowen versus Kendrick, Rosenberger versus Rector, Agostini versus Felton, Mitchell v. Helms. These cases really moved legal doctrine in the direction of what's now known as equal treatment or neutrality approach. In other words, the constitutional rule for federal provision, federal engagement with contractors is neutrality. Religious charities are eligible, but on a neutral basis in terms of which religious charities, and also on a neutral basis in terms of non-religious charities. And that neutrality doctrine has been the prevailing doctrine since the late 1980s, and that was the constitutional climate in which George W. Bush established the faith-based initiative. So maybe in the questions we can go into a bit more detail on the policy history of the faith-based initiative and that effort to sort of take the more accommodating constitutional environment and apply it at a policy level. But again, just to remind you, the goal of that was to, in a more neutral, pluralistic way, to enlarge the role of of religious providers in the social safety net, and to do that in a way that didn't put a high price of secularization on that involvement. And President Obama actually kept the apparatus of the faith-based initiative intact, much to the dismay of civil liberties groups when he entered his first term. But in other respects of application and implementation, in my view, it's been a very disappointing progress compared to what George W. Bush set out to do. And I think the upshot is that we've had a very good beginning constitutionally and policy-wise toward a sort of happy ending to the American Kulturkampf in this area. But there's a lot that's still up in the air, and I'm hoping that subsequent administrations will return to this issue again and make sure that we keep progressing in the right direction. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm John Bacchia from Williams College. Very happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. So I'm going to talk briefly about how an economist conceptualizes the rationale for a tax subsidy for charitable giving and what sorts of factors the optimal subsidy would depend on. And I think most of my talk will be about the empirical evidence on whether the tax subsidy that we have now is actually effective at increasing charitable donations. And that's where I've made my own contribution, so I'll spend more time on that. Okay. Yep. Okay, so Emmanuel Saez, who you may be familiar with from his work on income inequality, provides a wonderfully clear and thoughtful way of thinking about what should tax policy towards charitable donations be. And it's mathematically dense, but he's taken pretty much everything you'd want to take into account. So let me just talk a little bit about his framework, and then I'll talk about how evidence can feed into thinking about this. So in Saez's framework, it's meant to be a normative model of what government policy should be, not a predictive or positive model of how the political system is actually going to behave. So let me say that at the outset. So he says if the goal is to maximize utilitarian social welfare, so that would take into account both the fact that we care about economic efficiency. So for example, if we have very high taxes on the rich, it's going to have some sort of costs in terms of lost economic productivity. But on the other hand, government can solve market failures, which would increase economic efficiency. And in addition, it takes into account that an additional dollar may be worth more happiness to a poor person than a rich person. Okay, so embedded in a framework like that, the main rationale for a subsidy to voluntary private charitable donations would be that there's a positive externality involved. So the idea is basically, for most goods that are bought and sold on a competitive market, people are going to make a good decision about only buying things when the benefits exceed the costs in dollars. So when I decide whether to buy another cup of coffee for $1, I'll only buy it if the social benefits, which are the benefits to me, exceed or are equal to $1. Okay, so I'll get that decision right from an efficiency perspective. With a charitable donation, though, I must be getting some benefit from it if I voluntarily decide to give to charity. Otherwise, I wouldn't do it. But I may not take into account enough the benefits that go to other people. So unlike my cup of coffee, obviously if I donate to charity, that's producing benefits to other people that are worth something in dollars as well. So if there's no tax subsidy, I will only give an additional $1 to charity if it gives me $1 of happiness. And even if it's giving $2 of happiness to somebody else, I might decide not to do it. Okay? So that, it's a classic case where there's a market failure and we might want to correct it with some kind of subsidy. So just like we might want to correct pollution problems by taxing the things that cause pollution, we might want to subsidize this sort of positive externality type behavior. Okay? Now, in addition, the optimal subsidy is going to be larger when that externality is larger, and that's a question on which we don't have great evidence. So, it could be that some donations are really more like donations to a club where everybody really could be excluded from benefiting if they don't pay the price, so it could just be a market transaction. But the club sort of agrees that, hey, to get this tax subsidy, we're going to make it a voluntary donation, and we'll all agree to give. That wouldn't really be, if that's what's going on, then this is not enhancing efficiency at all. However, if the benefits really are non-excludable, there's no feasible way to exclude people from these benefits, then it may be very efficient to have this subsidy. Okay? So another thing, which is going to be the main focus of my talk, is other things equal, the optimal subsidy is going to be a lot larger when the subsidy is actually effective at increasing giving. So I think we can all see the point if people are not responsive to the tax incentive at all. If you give exactly the same amount to charity, regardless of how much we incentivize you, then we're costing government revenue without actually producing the desired result. And costing government revenue has side effects. Like, for example, if we want to pay for the same size government, we're going to have to raise other taxes that do distort your behavior and cost economic productivity. If people are very responsive to this, on the other hand, then it would tend to strengthen the case for having such a subsidy and having a larger subsidy. In addition, whether government spending crowds out private donations affects the optimal size of the subsidy. So the reasoning here is subtle. So the idea is, for example, if the government contributes more to NPR, maybe people donate less on their own to NPR. So why would that play any role in figuring out what the optimal subsidy is? Well, if that sort of thing is going on, it makes it more expensive to provide a given amount of public goods through taxation and government supply of the goods. So, for example, it could be, say, that if the government wants to raise another $1 of revenue, it actually costs $1.20 when you account for the administrative costs and maybe the distorted economic behavior that costs some productivity. Okay, so it costs us $1.20 to get $1 worth of benefits, but it might be good because maybe it's solving a market failure, which means the benefits are higher than $1, or it has some sort of equity rationale. Okay, if there's crowding out, though, like let's say when the government spends another $1, it ends up causing other people to reduce their donations by 40 cents. That means it's costing us $1.20 to only get 60 cents more of the public good. Okay, so that's making it much more expensive to do it through government, and therefore we might be more inclined to do it through private donations. Okay, so those are all things that are well understood in the literature. I should also say it depends on some other things too, right? So in Sayaz's model, he's assuming that the government is adjusting its spending in response to donations in order to maximize social welfare. So this is useful for thinking about some of the points we saw earlier. So in Sayaz's framework, if the rich are giving to things that are really public goods, even if they don't benefit the poor, it might still be really efficient to do that. We're not going to get enough of those things if we don't subsidize them. And if your concern is distribution, well, the government could adjust the progressivity of the rest of the tax system to offset that, if that's the concern. So if government is always trying to maximize social welfare, we would, that would have some implications. Now, that may not be realistic politically, and we'll think about that a little bit later. Another important consideration is, are private donations and what the government is doing, perfect substitutes. And in many cases, they're not. They're not doing exactly the same thing. So, for example, for constitutional reasons, government is not going to be as involved in religious activities, which may have a public good element. So they're not providing the same kinds of things. In addition, it could be the case, and this speaks to the pluralism argument, that there may be public goods that benefit a minority, and that might not happen through the political system. And our pluralistic system, A, for efficiency reasons, and B, for holding together the republic, might want to subsidize that to make people feel, A, like they're getting the efficient outcome, and B, are happier about living in this democracy. So if what the government is doing and what private donations are financing are very different, then that would strengthen the case for having a subsidy like this. In addition, it matters what the relative efficiency of government expenditures versus donations are. So, for example, we'd want to take into account, are the administrative costs of collecting taxes higher or lower than the administrative costs of fundraising? So things like that. But in addition, some people argue that maybe private charitable giving might have efficiency advantages. Maybe they come up with clever ways of doing things, and that's related to the pluralistic argument. And then, we might want to take into account the distributional effects, especially if government is not adjusting what it does to maximize social welfare. So all those things are relevant. So I'm mainly going to focus on just this one question of, are donations responsive to this tax incentive? But all those other things very important for thinking about what the right policy is. Okay, so the way economists usually summarize how responsive giving is to the tax incentive is what's called the price elasticity of charitable giving. So we think of charitable giving as like a consumer good that gives you some kind of warm glow. So it lights up those centers in your brain that they talked about yesterday. So you get some sort of warm glow from it. And we can summarize, we can sort of think of the tax incentive as reducing the price of giving another dollar to charity. The price of giving $1 to charity is $1 minus the tax savings from doing so. So for example, if you are an itemizer on your federal tax return and you're in the 35% tax bracket, if you want to give $1 to charity, it only costs you 65 cents of other foregone consumption. So it's like we've reduced the price of giving $1 to 65 cents. And the price elasticity just means the percentage change in charitable donations caused by a 1% more increase in price. So part of the reason economists like to focus on this as a summary measure of responsiveness to incentives is, well, first of all, if it was zero, it would clearly just be a windfall to givers and would be costing us revenue, so it would clearly be a bad idea. If it's smaller than 1 in absolute value, it means that the subsidy costs more government revenue than it induces in extra donations. Okay, so that's the Treasury efficiency threshold that was mentioned earlier. Now, if the price elasticity of charitable giving is smaller than 1 in absolute value, is the charitable price subsidy a bad policy? Well, it depends. It depends on a lot of those things we talked about earlier. It's only really like this 1 is only really a critical value under the assumption that government and private donations are really supplying exactly the same thing and they're doing it equally well. If they're supplying very different things, you might want to have this subsidy even if the price elasticity is much lower. In addition, if there's a lot of government crowding out of private donations, you might want to have a subsidy even when the price elasticity is a lot lower. So all these things factor in here. So the assumption that you shouldn't have a price subsidy for charitable giving unless the price elasticity is greater than 1 in absolute value only holds under very restrictive assumptions. And the other assumption you need is that government is adjusting what it does to maximize social welfare, which politically doesn't seem realistic. So, okay. All right, so how do we get credible evidence on what this price elasticity is? Well, ideally, we'd want a randomized experiment, and there have been some small stakes experiments done, and I'll talk about one of them. But nobody's going around and randomly assigning some billionaire philanthropists to get millions of dollars of tax incentives and other people don't, right? So we don't really have a controlled experiment here. The next best thing we could do is try to come up with like a quasi-experiment, which often involves what we call a difference in differences comparison. So you try to find groups that had different changes over time in the incentive and see how their giving changed relative to each other over time. Okay, so the idea being if there's differences across people, but they're fairly persistent over time, they probably can't explain why their giving changed. And there are all sorts of differences across people, like religiosity and altruism, that we can't observe but might be fairly persistent over time. This approach can help get around those problems. The assumption you need for a difference in differences comparison to be good and convincing and unbiased evidence would be we need to assume that the donations in the change over time in donations in the treatment group would have been the same as what that change was in the control group in the absence of the treatment, where here the treatment would be changing your tax incentive. Okay? So there's a lot of challenges to that. So first of all, where do you find sort of plausible treatment and control groups? There's all sorts of unobserved influences on charitable behavior, and some of them could be changing in different ways over time for different people, in which case the difference in differences might not solve it. It's very difficult to disentangle the effects of income on giving from the effects of price because they go hand in hand. Your tax rate is an increasing function of your income. So when your income goes up, your tax rate goes up. It's hard to tell which is causing a change in your behavior. And another important issue, which I'll talk about, is it's hard to distinguish whether people are retiming their giving in response to easily predictable differences in prices over time, for example, because of a federal tax reform or because you had a temporarily high income that put you in a higher tax bracket and therefore made it a good year to donate to charity. And we want to distinguish that from like the long run responsiveness to a change in prices, which is what really matters for policy. Okay. So here's a picture of, so I worked with Brad Heim, who was at the Treasury Department, who had great data on federal income tax returns that heavily oversampled high-income people who account for a really big share of giving. And I worked a lot to figure out what the price of giving was for people at different points in the income distribution over time. And so in a nutshell, so this is showing from the late 70s through the mid-2000s. The black line is showing what happened to the price of giving for millionaires. Okay, and these are people with $1 million of income and constant $2,007. And you can see the price went way up because marginal tax rates on high-income people went way down. Okay, so this is how, so prices went way up. The price of giving increased a lot for the very rich. For people in, say, the $100,000 to $200,000 income range, the green line, the change in prices was much more modest. Okay, so a lot of the research on this question has treated the rich as a treatment group and the middle class as a control group, both because the rich have a lower price of giving because of the tax system and because they change differently over time, the two groups. Over there on the other side of the screen, it shows, according to our data, charitable giving as a percentage of income and how that's changed over time for these different income classes. So a lot of the traditional literature arguing that charitable giving behavior was very responsive to incentives was just comparing at a given point in time in 1 year giving by rich people compared to middle class people. And they concluded, well, look, rich people give a lot more of their income to charity, a lot higher share of their income, and they face a lower price, so that's evidence that people are very responsive to price. But that's not very convincing evidence because it's hard to tell whether they're really giving a lot more to charity because they're rich or because they have the low price. And they try to deal with that econometrically, but it involves all sorts of arbitrary assumptions which are not convincing at all. Okay, so we can't really tell just based on comparing across people in a given year. Now, it might be a little more plausible to assume that in the absence of this big change in tax policy that we see here, the giving of the rich would have changed in the same way as the giving of the middle class, who had a much smaller change in price, right? So we could treat the middle class as a control group and the rich as a treatment group and do this difference in differences comparison, right? Did the group that got the big tax cut and therefore had a big increase in price, did their giving go down relative to the other group? And you can see the graph is pretty consistent with that, although if you actually do the math, it turns out that this leads to a surprisingly low responsiveness. The change in price was so big that the relative decline in giving for the rich seems surprisingly small. Okay? So, but a problem with that comparison is the middle class is not a good control group for the rich. There are all sorts of things that were changing differently for the rich over this time period compared to the middle class. For instance, their incomes were skyrocketing. The share of income going to the top 1% went from about 10% to 20% over this period. And it could be that their giving is going down less than we thought because they're getting so much richer. Okay, so that could explain some of it. And now we're expressing this as a percentage of income, but maybe the percentage of income you give to charity rises when your income goes up, and that could explain what's going on. Their wealth went up, and oftentimes we have no data on wealth in tax return data. So I think that's not super convincing either. So the approach that so basically there's not much consensus in the literature based on those kinds of comparisons. So some people find a pretty small price elasticity, some people find very big ones. One reason for that should give us pause is this randomized experiment by Carlin and List, where they randomly assigned some donors to an NGO to get different matching rates from a wealthy philanthropist, which is economically pretty similar to offering different tax subsidies, but framed very differently. And what they found was like giving people a matching rate or a subsidy increased their giving, but it didn't matter how much of a match rate you gave. So changing the price once you gave any subsidy at all had no effect on people's giving. So this implied a very small price elasticity. I don't think we can really extrapolate from that to tax policy, and List doesn't either. He just wrote a review saying he thinks the price elasticity is around 1 or -1. Because this was not a high-income sample, and also there are important differences between this kind of a match and a tax incentive. For example, if I hear that some wealthy philanthropist is going to give a match, I'm not sure how credible that is. You know, maybe he was just going to give the same amount anyway, and this is just a marketing scheme or something like that. And in addition, you know, they just sent mailers to people's houses, and a lot of people just threw them away without even looking at the match. So I don't know if we can. You can't freely throw away your tax returns. So it may be different. One interesting approach is comparisons across people who have different state tax incentives in a single year suggest a very large price elasticity. So we're going to try to build on that kind of approach. So one useful thing for our purposes is that the price of giving went up a lot more over time in some states than others, both because of state tax policies, but also their interactions with the federal tax policy. So for example, in 1991, they started putting a limitation on the amount of itemized deductions you could subtract from your taxable income at the federal level. And it turns out, for technical reasons about how the formula works, this has no effect at all on your incentive to give if you live in a state with an income tax. Because in that kind of state, you'll have enough itemized deductions that you'll never get to the point where it actually starts affecting your incentive. It will reduce your itemized deductions, but it's really just a tax on your income. But if you live in a low-tax state like Florida or Texas, this has a big effect on your incentive to give to charity. So for a lot of these people at the margin, giving another $1 of charity, they only get to deduct 20 cents of that. Okay, so that's a big effect. And so what happened was, essentially, in high-tax states like California and New York that have a charitable deduction, the price of giving went up about 17% less than states like Florida and Texas that don't have an income tax. So this is not the data that Brad Heim and I actually use. This is publicly available data, but it basically gives the gist of what we're finding. So what this shows is controlling for percent change in income and percent change in house prices and other things you might expect would affect charity. Each dot on this graph is a different state, and bigger states have bigger bubbles. Okay. And basically what we find is states that had a bigger increase in price had a bigger decline over time in charitable giving. So that's basically we're doing a difference in differences comparison across states. And this graph sort of illustrates this. This is also, you know, so you should think of like the percent change in price as relative to the average percent change, and also the change that's above and beyond what you would predict based on the change in income and other things that we can observe. And same thing with the percent change in charity. So that's a comparison between 1979 and the mid-1990s, when price went up a lot more in some states than others. And this is, again, for high-income people with incomes above $200,000. If you make the same comparison between 1979 and the mid-2000s, you get a similar result. I mean, it's a little bit obscured by the wide scale here, but we find a downward relationship here. And it implies basically a price elasticity of somewhere on the order of negative 1.5, okay, is what these comparisons do. What I did with Brad Heim was I worked with him using confidential Treasury data, which had about 330,000 mostly high-income tax returns, where they follow people over time for a long period of time. So you can get a good measure of their permanent income and their sort of long-run charitable giving behavior. And it heavily oversampled high-income people. So we had a lot of people who were affected by this experiment we're describing. And it's essentially a difference in differences comparison across states. We're looking at if your price went up more in your state, did your giving go down more? Okay? And we're comparing people with similar income levels but different states. And our bottom line estimate is a price elasticity of about negative 1.4 with a 95 confidence interval between negative 1 and negative 1.8. So this kind of comparison is suggesting people are pretty responsive. So I think in the interest of time, I'll wrap up here. But what I would say is, this is not an experimental study, so I wouldn't bet $1 million on it. And we're working some more on this to try to exploit other things that are like quasi-experiments. But I think in economics, we're making progress on finding somewhat more credible evidence than we've had in the past. And it seems to be pointing in the direction that people are indeed pretty responsive to this incentive. One last thing I'll say is, we have the most confidence in this estimate for high-income people because those are the people for whom we had a good experiment. Okay, for middle-income people, we have less confidence about what the price elasticity is. And we have at least some suggestive evidence it might be smaller for the people in the middle incomes, in which case, given the framework I laid out earlier, it actually would be efficient to have higher price subsidies for those higher income people, which is the way the tax system works now. So I wouldn't make that claim with a lot of confidence, though, because, like I said, we don't have a great experiment for the middle class. Okay, so thank you.
We have about 20 minutes for questions. While people make their way to the microphone, maybe I'll start with a question for Rob. And the question is whether we have data on giving that would give us an indication of how much is devoted to associational activity, to the creation of voice in our nonprofit universe.
I don't think we have good data about that, but now, after having seen John's presentation, I think it's instructive to compare the framework he set up with this pluralism rationale, and then to speculate about what the data might look like. So, when he put up that slide, John, when you put the slide that suggested, if the goal was to maximize social utility, and by that we were trying to measure social utility by the particular social goods that were produced, then price elasticity would matter a lot. We want evidence, and the whole research program that John just described for you is often running. I want to make just two quick observations about that. So first of all, the pluralism rationale suggests, if not a rejection of the goal of maximizing social utility, at least a different conceptualization of that particular measure. In other words, the pluralism rationale might not care so much about maximizing utils of social good, however they are produced by the state, by nonprofits, by individuals, whatever it happens to be, but rather the constitution of a diverse and egalitarian and flourishing civil society, which itself will have some utility, but will be much more difficult to measure. So there's a contrast there. And then the second kind of assumption packed into what John described in the framework was that the kinds of things, the kinds of social goods that were being produced, the kinds of things you expect to have a lot of social welfare, are those that economists describe as public goods. They're non-rival and non-excludable. They produce things that are impossible for only a small number of people to enjoy. The descriptive reality, however, of charitable giving in the United States is that at best, very little of charitable giving actually produces public goods that, in that strict definition. Possibly even none of it fits that that description. I mean, perhaps I don't want to say this with any mean-spirited intent or motivation at all, but John described, well, if what you were producing with charitable giving was a club good, it's like paying your membership due. Well, I showed you the data about how the majority of, not the majority, but the largest category of charitable giving in the U.S. is to church. That's kind of an economic description of club good. Strictly speaking, they can't exclude people from walking and enjoying it, but unless you happen to think, and there might be some reason to think there are these great positive externalities of religiosity and church attendance, you would have to conceive of, you certainly wouldn't conceive of giving to your church as a strict public good. So all of which is to say, I think the tax subsidy structure as we currently have it is premised, as John described, on some notion of social utility maximization where you hope you're producing something like a pure public good. Descriptively speaking, we are a long, long way from that, which is to say, perhaps, that more of what charitable giving actually is, descriptively and perhaps motivated by, is the pluralism civil society rationale. Data about how much, I don't have any answer to that.
I don't see a microphone there. I wonder, do you want to move over to this one?
I stole it.
Oh, you stole it.
I was just waiting. I'm learning how to attend conferences. If you want to ask a question, you got to sit there and then move up. But because the question was already in my mind, because of the title in the program, I could see God and the welfare state. This is a very interesting country to live in because structurally the United States is a very secular place. Public reason never cites the Quran or the Bible or whatever, but the religiosity figures are very high. Yeah. So we're in a pretty big bind, and that's where I'm coming from. I'm going to sort out this giving business with a criterion that I'm borrowing from John Rawls, which is his, some people will know this, his famous proviso, that religious people who operate in the public realm, in foundations, in giving, in all of three of your presentations, and the tax structure, religious people who want to benefit, let's say, from the tax structure and all that, or operate in the legislature, should, it's okay for them to use their sacred text. But, and this is Rawls, they can only do so unless, or if they at the same time, provide neutral, additionally scientifically grounded, publicly accessible, mutually shareable reasons. And that criterion I would propose to all three of you to inject in your presentation. What would happen if you adopted this in your, that would not be the ideal state, that would be the real state within where giving is not enough. I'm coming at this from the human rights perspective. If we adopt this Rawlsian criterion, then maybe we could get someplace, because saving souls is a good, depending on where you're coming from. But I don't think it's a public good. Whereas using this criterion will sort out those two things. Thank you.
Yeah, a great question. I don't agree with the Rawlsian model of public reason, actually, but it pertains very much to the controversy over faith-based issues. And let me give you an example. When I was in seminary, I did field work in a prison as an assistant to a chaplain. In the context of chaplaincy, Reverend Hawk, who I worked with, was the community organizer. He was the human rights advocate. He was the service provider. He was the community liaison with family. He did everything, but all within the context of his ministry. In the legalities of the faith-based initiative, even today, when we have a more accommodating environment for cooperation between religion and government, there is still a very strict line in terms of the flow of funds must be separated from primary religious activities. And the criteria, there is a public criteria of, we have a statute that has an objective, and we've voted for the people who passed the statute, and the voters support that objective, and that is the ultimate objective of the contract, in the contracting regime, not saving souls. However, looked at in a more instrumental way, where religious charities are very effective in achieving those social objectives in a context of religious practice. And I saw this in the context of the prison work that I was doing. Do we, in fact, as long as religious charities are effective, is it really the case that we need to exclude the religious viewpoint and the religious practice from a social service contract? According to Rawls, yes. According to my, in my opinion, no.
I would add one other thing. So I think there's an important difference with exactly the question you raised between direct government expenditures and indirect government supports, where indirect government supports of the sort I was describing, a tax incentive for an individual donation, might look very different. If the state were to be providing direct expenditures for the saving of souls by funding religious organizations, it would run afoul of the Rawlsian public reason justification. On the other hand, if it provided a neutral incentive for people to be the agents that were the distribution of dollars, partly tax subsidized so that there were in fact public dollars attached to them, but also their own private dollars, for the support of their favored projects, even if those favored projects happen to be religious ones, then the agent making the decision about the distribution of the dollars is the individual, not the state, and the neutral justification, the public reason consistent justification on which that can be supported, is that the availability of that subsidy is universally applicable to any citizen, especially for those who have minority projects that they wish to support. This is the pluralism rationale at work. So you don't get direct government support of the faith-based social services, but you get indirect government support consistent with public reason rationale through charitable contributions.
First off, I just want to say thank you for this question of should government incentivize altruism specifically to the least. I think that that's kind of the key link between what you guys were saying. Lou, you just said the comment about if the organization is effective. And to me, what's really fascinating is the impetus before faith-based initiative was Clinton's charitable choice. And one of the promises of charitable choice was that it would not just equal the playing field, but that it would improve accountability. So it said these faith-based organizations will no longer have to create a separate 501c3. They can apply, and then they'll be held to the same standards as the other social service organizations that already have to abide by federal or municipal standards. Mm-hmm. That promise never played out. But what's interesting to me is if you also ask the question of does the government also have a responsibility to protect the most vulnerable citizens, which would be those that are often receiving social services, what is that link? And so my question is about, if we I think we're penalizing faith-based organizations by not allowing them to apply for those grants now. And the question is, if you look at like a mission, for example, in New York City, they're not required to abide by the same standards as the city shelter. Salvation Army's recovery program doesn't have to file under OASIS. So none of those organizations are required to abide by the same standards that the city requires other programs to abide by. With the huge move of Medicaid reform, health homes, none of them have to go on board with that, so they don't have the same standards. They don't, for example, let's say New York City Rescue Mission, their donors don't require they report recidivism or placements. Whereas DHS requires that a city shelter report recidivism and placements. So they're held accountable to make sure that they're moving people as quickly as possible through emergency housing in a shelter to permanent supportive housing. So my question is, not to be heavy-handed, because I'm all in favor of the faith-based organizations being able to have an equal playing field, but should there be an even greater role as public assistance is not going away for the poor? Do we have a responsibility to require that they follow those standards, that all recovery centers have to file under OASIS, that we can track someone through the system? Or is that, is that too heavy-handed?
Well, so the question of lesser accountability for faith-based providers, that applies to the nonprofit sector contracting in general, I assume, right?
Yeah.
And obviously there's the problem of the bigger agencies versus the smaller agencies in terms of accountability. I think all organizations that receive social service contracts or grants should be held to the same standards of accountability. I do think that there is a problem of pluralism in that because of that, or because of what should be, and there are some aspects of accountability, obviously. Smaller faith-based providers, the more associational part of our service culture is excluded because they don't have the resources to be able to meet the standards. So this was one of the things that the Bush administration was trying to work on. They set up a whole network of intermediary, if you will, incubator groups to help smaller agencies with the federal contracting requirements, and that's an ongoing process. One thing I would say is that, sort of in the conservative selling of faith-based initiatives over the years, it was always sort of stipulated or assumed that faith-based groups were more effective, when in fact, according to John DiIulio and other experts who have studied this, there's no evidence of that. And so I always said that let's stop selling it on the argument of effectiveness and let's start selling it on an argument from democracy. Now, in fact, Byron Johnson's work shows that there is a faith factor. He's beginning to put together some really excellent evidence in the field of sort of gang intermediation and around the criminal justice system, that there does seem to be a faith factor there where faith-based organizations are more effective on issues of recidivism and things like that in their ministries. So that's an area where you have potentially an argument from effectiveness where faith-based organizations are more effective cutting up against these church-state barriers. So even in the terms of the objective of a social welfare statute, the social objective, we may need to keep rethinking these church-state boundaries precisely in order to serve that objective.
I'd like to follow up on just that question for Rob and John, knowing that our nonprofit sector and philanthropy is an artifact of the state. Our accountability regime is an artifact of tax policy. And I wonder if either of you would have comments on an accountability regime in this country, unlike some other countries, that is so heavily reliant on our tax regime.
Yeah, the accountability structure for the nonprofit sector does indeed flow through the tax system. And for any of you in the room who work in a nonprofit or run one, you know that basically consists in filing an annual 990 form, which has, relatively speaking, precious little information about how effective an organization you are. It's just an accounting form mainly about the cash flow and how much the highest paid officers of an organization make, and some information about whether or not you engage in lobbying activities and such. I think the pluralism rationale, as opposed to the kind of rationale that was the assumed bedrock of the research program John was describing, if what you're after is maximizing social welfare, the entire question about a subsidy and then the elasticity numbers you get out of that, estimates you get out of that, is going to be very dependent upon whether or not charitable giving actually is producing social welfare. So we had better find an accountability structure that gives us the information to assess that. On the other hand, the pluralism rationale is at the very least a bit more accommodating of a more unregulated, if you will, unaccountable associational sphere for the purpose of using citizen voice to do all kinds of different things. It's accountable in a different respect, but not towards this outcome-oriented welfare maximization. And I guess this gets to your question too. Given the numbers I showed you about both the unbelievable number of nonprofit organizations in the United States, between 1.3, 1.9 million, depending on how you count, and a massive and rapid new creation of nonprofits every year, which are virtually, it's just a kind of legal procedure to go through. You can have practically any mission you want, whatever micro cause you have, almost genuinely, so long as you promise not to distribute revenue you take in as profit to shareholders, you are good to go as a 501c3 organization. So on the whole, you've got 1.9 million nonprofits. If you thought that delivering social goods in a welfare maximizing way was going to be efficiently driven by 1.9 million nonprofits with 70,000, 60,000 new ones being created every year, at the very least, that seems like a research program worth pursuing that my prediction would be at the start, probably not the most highly effective way to do things, which is partly why the pluralism rationale for me has a bit more of an attraction.
Yeah, so as you said, I think the way we, basically all the IRS is trying to do is make sure you're not donating something to something that's really like a market transaction. And they're not, as you say, trying to promote social welfare or make sure this is the best use of your funds in terms of providing public goods. That's right. Now, with that said, I mean, donors have an incentive to make sure that's happening, so.
What is that incentive?
So that their giving may be motivated by concern for the social good. And I think it's heartening that we do see some developments about making it more transparent, what fundraising costs are in various charities, and also things like as far as giving to that will ultimately benefit developing countries. There's now all these websites that are saying, okay, well, which interventions are really backed up as effective by randomized evaluations and things like this. Now, this is a tiny fraction of giving, but you can imagine if there could be a demand among donors for this sort of thing, and it's becoming increasingly easy through technology to supply that. So
I want to jump in on that too. So the GiveWell, this organization in particular that raised charities, was a couple people who run for the organization were here yesterday, and it was mentioned a bunch of times. And I mean, if you were really looking for some accountability measures in the way you were describing, the donor might have an incentive to feel like he or she wants the maximally best use of his or her charitable donation. Treat a charitable gift as if it were an investment, and you look for the biggest return on your investment in terms of social welfare. Then the kind of thing GiveWell provides would be great. On the other hand, again, I want to just remind everyone, I suppose, that if the largest recipient of charitable dollars in the US is religion, I don't know a single person who thinks of his or her charitable donation to their church and thinks, well, if I could give it to the church I go to, but I want to learn more about the outcome orientation of the congregation across town. Oh, they're really knocking it out of the park, whatever it is they're saving souls at a greater rate over there. I think I'll go make my donation in that respect. GiveWell for religious giving is like a category mistake. There's just that doesn't work. And the data that we have for organizations in the GiveWell mode, is for a tiny, tiny fraction of nonprofits that actually exist. So I guess this is to suggest skepticism that if we were trying to describe donor behavior as taking on board an incentive for an outcome orientation, not much evidence that exists.
I have to add a historical footnote that John D. Rockefeller and his advisor Frederick Gates back in the early 1900s infuriated their fellow Baptists when they found Lutherans and Congregationalists more efficient in overseas missionary activities. Amy?
Okay, so I want to stay with this faith-based question because there are a couple of things that disturb me about the aggregation that happened in this discussion. So if we talk about faith-based organizations, the whole discussion has treated all faiths as equal from a couple of perspectives, and all giving as equal in the aggregate of 501(c)(3). So we didn't see any numbers because those weren't the questions you asked of, okay, 1.3, maybe 2 million organizations, but if we look at the largest 500 of them, what percentage of the funds represented by giving do those 500 organizations represent, and what is their purchasing power in the sector. And I think that's a really important question to ask, and I think it's also really important when we move to looking at faith-based organizations, faith-based giving, because the assumption in the discussion is that pluralism is good, and that's fine, but I speak now from a very different experience of democracy, where it's a democracy where not only is there not separation of church and state, but there is a predominant state. I live in Israel, and I have a great deal of experience looking at the Turkish case, which ironically has a very rigid state-imposed distinction between church and state and separation of church and state on the French model of subsuming religion and the administration of religion under this state, not being separate. I really wonder what happens if we look at all of this and don't assume that all religions have equal effectiveness and power to mount faith-based organizations. And I think that if we look at, if we go back to Black's opinion, which sounds very, very radical and rigid, but in fact, if you were to spin it out to the logical conclusion of his fears, there is something there if you look at it from a minority religion status. If you look at it from a minority race status, if you look at the questions from minority gender status, or even from majority gender status, speaking as a woman, and looking at the impact of, for instance, the extraordinary generosity of Catholic hospitals operating in our kind of general hospital sphere in the United States, and what the impact of that is then on the product of healthcare that is available and offered. So I think that we need to kind of inject a little bit more problematization and variability and politicization, if you will, into the whole discussion of pluralism and faith-based organizations, to recognize that they're not all equal, that they don't all have equal economic power. And I think that I don't think that there's an easy answer, and I think this might be one reason for not, in fact, allowing the expansion of faith-based organizations, because I think that we have to choose where we're going to put the watchdogs on our civil liberties. And that doesn't mean that there aren't roles for faith-based organizations, but it does mean that we need to choose which things we're going to safeguard. And we have to prioritize, because we can't just assume that it's all equal.
Could we then turn to Joanne's question and see if we could use a kind of wrap-up?
Jim, could I also just...
And Pat's question. Oh, okay, we have... Let's aggregate all of the queries. Joanne, Warren, yeah. Pat?
Okay, I think mine is very sort of simple and brief, but the whole discussion of tax deductions leaves out the 70% of citizens who don't itemize. And so in a certain way, the whole discussion is very limited. It's talking about just 30% of taxpayers, and I'm assuming they tend to be the upper income taxpayers again. So that, and I know Rob has written about this, and I know he has a solution which I find extremely convincing, and I'm certainly not going to reveal it for him. He can do that easily. But, but it just seems like his approach, or one of your two approaches, I like the one of the tax exemption with the cap, then takes in everyone, all taxpayers, and I think eliminates all of these problems for me about, you know, how you have to kind of keep subsidizing the wealthy to give more, all of which I find problematic politically and ethically.
Well,
Warren.
My name is Warren Ilchman. I think this discussion is not as rich as the subject matter. And there's such diversity. For instance, Rob's point about 501c3, the numbers are 1,000,003, but in terms of the whole 501c category, it's 1.9. Now, there are a lot of organizations that are not 501c3, but they get tax provisions also. not deductions, but they don't pay property tax and they don't pay excise tax.
Just a quick footnote, the reason why for 501c3 the number is uncertain is that religious organizations do not need to file and be formally recognized.
But there are about 328,000 religious organizations that use their sort of master list. So we begin by realizing that the 501c category is much richer and much denser and provides much more probability in terms of taxing because of the various things. Secondly, let's pick up religion. People think that if 41% goes to religion, that's your dues for your club. Now, within 9 streets of this building, there's the Church of the Holy Apostles, which serves 1,000 people a day food. Secondly, my own church, a third of it goes to outreach, and a third goes to children's education. Often during, when schools are out and people need to have their children somewhere, my church provides that. And so are those my dues? They're not my children. I don't eat the food, although I help serve it in terms of outreach. Let's take some other choices. 96% of culture in Europe is in the state sector. Museums, philharmonic orchestras, and the like. 94% of culture, museums, and the like, are in the nonprofit sector in the United States. Radical difference. Likewise, 92% of all of higher education in Europe is in the state sector. But 60% of higher education at the graduate level in the United States is at the nonprofit level. Well, 42% is at the nonprofit level. The subject matter is so much more diverse and rich than I think the 3 discussions really gave us a chance to look at.
Yeah. Patricia Rosenfield, I've spent most of my life in international philanthropy, and John allows me a moment to raise this question, which began to disturb me yesterday with Peter Singer's Kantian approach, but then when the pluralism rationale is raised, the voices of the citizens of developing countries, which 22% of the top 1,000 foundations give in international giving, are not heard at all in that giving. So I'm wondering if we think about the globalization perspective, transboundary, how and then who pays taxes where, I'm wondering how one rationalizes international grant making in this country when those voices, under the pluralism perspective, are not heard. It's irrelevant whether we have the randomized experiments or not. Those voices are also not heard. So we really have a non-social utility maximization for developing countries when we give international assistance. So I'd really like to hear a different rationale for international assistance, international grant making.
Well, each of you pick a question.
Yeah, so a couple very quick responses. So to the first question about lumping everything together and not being more differentiating more amongst the kinds of faith-based organizations in particular. So the reason for me as a political scientist, political theorist to lump things together is that at the moment the tax code lumps them all together. Everything is lumped into the 501c3 or 501c category, and the incentive to give is not differentiated. So you don't get, I mean, you could, of course, in practice, you could just say, if your primary mission is to serve the poor, we'll increase the incentive to give relative to an organization which doesn't have the primary mission of serving the poor or isn't effective, or pick your favored mechanism. The gentleman who thought the discussion wasn't as rich as it could otherwise have been, yeah, absolutely correct. The 501c3 category was the main focus of discussion, and reflecting the view that the composition of cultural institutions in other parts of the world, much more heavily state, different here. I think I was again trying to suggest a more pluralist rationale for the kinds of projects that we might appropriately describe as worthy of the label charity or worthy of the label philanthropy. I hope to have captured something of that much more diverse array of vibrant associational life in the United States. And to this last question about the global perspective, I mean, again, I find this one of the most important practically because of the actually existing needs of those who are in desperate circumstances, as well as theoretically. So take again, John's assumptions, or even the assumptions I started with about should we be social welfare maximizing, and how do we think about the array of associational life that we build out on a pluralism rationale? Well, those are assumptions built out on a contained domestic society. John's assumption, I think, wasn't about global social welfare maximization. I mean, it could be, although the idea of a domestic tax break premised on global social welfare maximization would be a peculiar thing. Think of it this way. The Gates Foundation and its global giving programs, whatever you happen to think of it, as a citizen of the United States, you might say to yourself, this is not going to be, I think, a friendly way of thinking about your point, but it's just a way of showing what I think the underlying framework ought to be. The Gates Foundation spends whatever billions of dollars it does on its global health programs at a cost to the US Treasury, because the money that was put in the foundation was tax exempt, whatever amount of money it is. It's a big number. If you know that the international development budget of the US is actually, what was it said yesterday, 2 or 3%, and yet we've lost X billion of dollars from the US Treasury. If I'm a poor American citizen, and I think to myself, given the tax breaks the Gates Foundation gets, or any foundation gets, for international development programs, why is the public supporting that without my having a vote or a say in what the spending preferences of the Gates Foundation happens to be? So the problem that you raise is not merely that the voices of those around the world aren't represented in the pluralism of the associational life here and international development. It's that the voices of citizens themselves with respect to the public subsidy aren't exactly represented either. What's heavily represented is the idiosyncratic preference of the person who sets up the foundation. That's really the only voice that matters in this context.
Lou or John, do you have?
Yeah, I just want to make 2 quick points. So on policy reform, if you want to extend tax benefits to middle and lower income people, or you want to save revenue, there's a lot to be said for doing it in a way that only provides a tax incentive for gifts above a certain percentage of your income rather than capping it. If you cap it, you take the giving of people who account for a huge portion of philanthropic gifts and get rid of the incentive entirely at the margin to give more to charity. You've turned the tax incentive now from an incentive to purely a reward for giving you would have done anyway, and there's no benefit for giving more, right? So, a much better plan would be, for example, a credit or a deduction for giving above, say, 2% of your income. That incentive-wise makes a lot more sense. In response to the other question, I mean, from a utilitarian perspective, yes, giving more internationally makes a lot of sense. And I think, let me just put in a plug for, there's an economist at UC San Diego, Paul Niehaus, who set up a nonprofit where what they do is they just find people with thatched roofs in developing countries and give them cash. And there's tons of randomized evaluation evidence that this has really positive effects, and it gives them a voice in what's the most important need for them to meet. So, and in fact, oftentimes these people are using it to contribute to a public good in their own village or something like this. I think it's a good idea.
To Dr. Singer's question, just some final comments. You're right. A secular social safety net is not a neutral social safety net. On the other hand, a neutral social safety net is not necessarily neutral in a society that has a dominant religion for political reasons, or that won't be the outcome. Pluralism and neutrality won't necessarily be the outcome. And I agree there need to be safeguards for that. Take the example of Europe, and I have done a lot of comparative work on European welfare state design versus the United States in terms of faith-based provision. The paradox, of course, that someone mentioned is that the US has a highly religious culture, but a highly secular state. Europe, in contrast, has a highly secular culture, but much more cooperation between church and state. Faith-based providers are predominant in the public social safety nets in many European countries. But if you take a case like the Netherlands, which has a highly pluralistic church-state arrangement for education and other social services, where faith-based organizations are integrated, well integrated into public regimes, and with lots of protection for their religious identity. However, as the Muslim population of the Netherlands has grown, that pluralism is raising new tensions in terms of how wide is the scope of religious participation between different religions. And so pluralism is working well in theory in the Netherlands, but less well in the practice, precisely because of these tensions that you're describing.
Well, I think it's time to thank all of our panelists, and it's been a very robust session. Thank you.